And it is a pleasure to have with us Sofia Donoso. She works at the University of Chile. She's an expert of social movements, but also social movements institutionalizations. And the talk she's given today is about one of the central interests in her work on the development of movement parties. She has been working a lot. She's, I would say, one of the most influential scholars in Latin America to write about social movements in different perspectives. She has edited with other colleagues a book on Marisa Fungulo, a book on social movements in Chile, where the different aspects of the Chilean development before the constitutional process have been addressed. She has a PhD from University of Oxford, and we are very glad to have her here also, because I think she can help us developing a comparative perspective between Latin America and Southern Europe, which seems to develop in parallel directions with a lot of reciprocal influence. So Sofia has been here for 3 weeks. She's here for the last week now. She will welcome contacts with the PhD students and the other colleagues. And so, Sofia, thank you very much for being with us. And please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Donatella, for the invitation to Scuola and the Institute for this fellowship. It has been a great time in Florence, and it has been really great to meet all of you. I've met with a few PhD students, and I have a few meetings left, Rosario and Ahmad. But I really enjoyed my time here. And today I'm gonna present some work that I've been doing about the Frente Amplio in Chile, but more from a comparative perspective, and also centered on the theoretical thoughts that I have been developing, trying to trace the institutionalization process of the student movement, which was my original research agenda. And so, So the outline for the lecture that I have in mind today has the following structure. Of course, this project and this research is part of a broader discussion on the rise of movement parties across the world, in Europe for sure, and also in Latin America. I will talk a little bit about the existing explanation on the emergence of new parties and sort of place the issue of the rise of movement parties specifically within that literature, arguing that we need to focus more on internal endogenous conditions when trying to understand the development and not only the rise of movement parties. Then I will talk through a few set of challenges that I think that movement parties have had to encounter in recent years, and that make their effort particularly difficult, so to say. And then I will talk about the framework that I have in mind on political learning and how that helps us to understand not only the rise of movement parties, but also the way in which they're able to survive and also grow through time. And then I will illustrate this framework with the case of the Frente Amplio in Chile, but also talk about other cases to see if we can find some common points of comparison. Of course, with the European case, that makes a lot of sense, as Donatella was saying previously. So, as you all know, we, since the early 2010s, we've seen the rise of social movements, massive social movements across the world, not only in Latin America, but also, of course, here in Europe. And we social movement scholars have become increasingly interested in how these social movements how their demands were channeled institutionally after the peak of the mobilization process was over. And as social movement scholars have identified, many of these social movement organizations decided to then take their struggle into the electoral arena and found political parties. In Spain, we have the case of Podemos, right? We have the case of Syriza in Greece. In the UK and in the US, where we have a quite strong two-party system, is of course much more difficult to create new parties, but nonetheless we've seen that social movements and the process of social mobilization related to Occupy London, Occupy Wall Street, shaped the Democrats in the US internally and also shaped labor internally, right? So we've seen how this wave of protests that was so important, not only in Europe and Latin America, but also, of course, in Northern Africa and other places in the world, has had deep political consequences in terms of policies, but also in terms of creating a new political landscape with new political forces, with new political parties, but when new political parties were not created, with shifting power relationships within the existing parties. There. So this, of course, is not a new phenomenon. We've had movement-originated parties historically, and there are many key party families that have their origins in social movement and in a mass-based organizational form. The socialist, communist, of course, and social democratic parties around the world have the roots in labor parties, in labor movements. And also, of course, the anti-nuclear and environmental movements in Europe paved the way for the emergence of the Green Party in both Germany and in France. So this is not a new phenomenon, and I will not argue that. But as we will see, there are certain conditions that have to do with the context in which the more recent movement parties emerge, which I think have profound consequences for their ability to survive and ability to address the challenges that I will outline. And in Latin America, of course, we also have a tradition of movement parties. So we have the Uruguay's Frente Amplio that was created in 1971 as a political instrument to restore democracy. And it was composed of social movements, especially the labor movement, together with other political forces such as the Christian Democrats, the socialists, and the communists. We have Brazil's Workers' Party, which was founded in 1980, also as a political instrument composed of a broad set of civil society actors and as a political instrument to restore democracy in that country. And more recently, we've had the creation of Bolivia's Movimiento hacia el Socialismo, which originated in rural movements and coca growers with a strong ethnic identity. And there are other cases, of course, but these are maybe the cases that have been more debated in the literature because of their survival and because, they've been in town, so to say, for a while now. So there is some discussion on those. But as I anticipated, there are some contextual factors that I argue, and Donatella and colleagues also argue, are different when we compare all the waves of emergence of movement parties or movement-originated parties and the current ones. So the current ones emerge and are a response, of course, to a quite sharp decline in political parties' ability to mediate between society and political institutions. And this has translated in a decline in party trust, in electoral participation, and party membership. So, of course, that context poses a set of challenges for emerging political parties. And there's also, especially after the 2008 economic crisis and the conflicts that emerged from that crisis and the austerity measures, there's also, of course, a gradual development of a new cleavage structure that have resulted by both those economic and political difficulties that stem from that crisis. So we have like a system of winners of losers that have paved the way for movement parties, not only on the left, and this is important to highlight, but also, of course, from the right, that have politicized those grievances that have emerged from that crisis. And in Latin America, we also have had a deep implementation of neoliberal policies in several policy areas. And that, of course, has created a lot of marginalized groups whose grievances have also been politicized by emerging parties. So this is a part of the new contextual factors that I argue are different from older generations of movement parties that also evolved throughout longer periods of time before they actually were able to come into power. So they had more time also to sort of adapt to their context. So what does the literature tell us? So what sort of elements can we extract from the literature to explain the emergence of movement parties such as Podemos in Spain, but also as the Frente Amplio in Chile, that I will talk a little bit more about later. So there are a few bodies of literature that focus on the exogenous elements that explain the emergence of parties in general. One, of course, has to do with the changes in people's preferences, which, of course, provides an opportunity for new parties to politicize those new preferences and create a constituencies that can become electorally favorable, right? And that was the case of the Green parties in Europe, but also, of course, of the extreme right more recently. So it's a whole body of literature that has focused on that perspective. Then, of course, there are theories that related to this. There are theories that focus more on how new issues have not been adopted or have been neglected, so to say, by existing political parties. So new parties emerge when those positions are too far from this discontent that is emerging, right? So that's another way of thinking, these voids of representations that are key for the emergence of parties in general and movement parties in particular. Then there are theories that focus more on the institutional context, changes of electoral rules, party registration, and so on and so forth, that, of course, provide incentives for new parties to emerge. And then there are authors that, of course, argue that we need to maybe combine some of these efforts to explain the emergence of parties, bottom-up pressures from underrepresented groups, but also the importance of institutional change when seeking to explain why new parties emerge. So in the paper that I submitted to Daniela and Lorenzo, me and Danisa, my co-author, we argue that this literature tend to be focus too much on exogenous factors in detriment to the internal dynamics of parties in general. And we need to understand how parties survive and grow, and not only explain their emergence, we also need to look at what happens inside the black box of the parties, right? So in other words, we need more focus on how the internal dynamics of parties. And that has been also an argument in recent literature by some great Latin American scholars that focus on Latin America and Latin American scholars that have said exactly that, right? That we need to have a much closer look at the internal dynamics of political parties. And in this context, the choices of party elites play a really important role, because, of course, when you have a new party, you need to, at the same time, construct the whole party structure, right? Like the internal governability structures and the the mechanism of decision making and so on and so forth. At the same time, you need to be active to not lose your voters, right? So that dilemma, of course, is quite difficult to make compatible, and so the strategic leadership of the party elites has been identified as a key dimension of this process. And so what does the literature say about the specific case of movement parties? So surprisingly, there is not too much literature. There is an ongoing discussion, of course, but of course not as much literature as the previous bodies of literature that I mentioned that focus on the specific case of movement parties. But there is some work by Herbert Kitchell that has been revisited in recent years, importantly by the book by Donatella and her colleagues from 2017. And this work was revisited to sort of try to understand the emergence of the more recent movement parties in Southern Europe. And what does Kitchell say about the emergence of movement parties? And this, of course, is an explanation that is situated within the larger political party literature that has to do with the emergence of political parties in general. So Kitchell, he argues that there are four main explanations to explain the emergence of movement parties. So first, the movement entrepreneurs might have information that political parties don't have. And so they have a clear idea of constituencies out there that don't feel represented. So they see this opportunity to politicize those issues, and they create a party to do that. But as Kitchell himself notes, this is not very likely to happen, really, because, of course, political party structures have a lot of resources. They have, money. They have surveys, so they have mapped, of course, their constituencies in clear ways, and movement entrepreneurs can very seldom, compete with that. But it's one of the explanations out there. A second explanation has to do with the institutional component, right? So the formal and informal barriers for entering the electoral arena. And that applies to other, non-movement parties as well. And then he also refers to the spatial theory of party competition, this idea of existing voice of representation out there, that new movement entrepreneurs, seek to politicize, and they create a political party to represent those demands that are not being represented at the moment. And then he briefly refers to political learning, and he defines it as a process through trial and error through which movement entrepreneurs come to the conclusion that a new political party is needed. But he doesn't elaborate too much on that. So while the three previous theories or bodies of theories have been, well developed and some of them dismissed, as for example the issue of asymmetrical information, the issue of political learning is only briefly mentioned in his text. So in this project, what I try to do is to make like a double click on that political learning, so to say, from the perspective of social movement scholarship. Coming from the field of social movement literature, I think that the social movement scholarship has a lot to say about how movement parties both emerge, but also how they react and how they develop their actions in order to also survive and growth throughout time. So that's a little bit the purpose of this presentation. And I also argue that that movement parties have that they have to face a specific set of challenges that are different from maybe other political parties, right? That are not originating in social movements. So a first set of challenges had to do with the relationship that movement parties have with their with the social movements from which they stem from. So movement parties stem from social movements, and presumably they want to keep and maintain those relationships and also deepen those relationships. Those relationships are really important because they give them electoral strength on the one hand, but also because they need that mobilization capacity to put pressure to advance their political agenda. And also they need to represent the new subjectivities that are emerging in new social movements and put them on the public agenda and political policy agenda. For instance, issues of feminist, sexual politics, environmental concerns, etc. And yet we know from the social movement literature that professionalization processes that also presumably movement parties will have to go through in order to work in the day-to-day, political life of institutional politics. We know that those processes might lead to a decreased capacity of mobilization. So there's a sort of a dilemma there, a challenge that I argue is specific for movement parties, and that they have to work out how to address that challenge. A second set of challenges has to do with the internal relationships. So because movement parties emerge from multiple organizations that converge, right? And we will see, as in the case of the Frente Amplio in Chile, it was 14 organizations. And I think this, is the case in many other movement parties. So there are many organizations that converge into this movement party. And that, of course, poses a set of additional challenges that had to do with this internal dimension of constructing governance structures and decision-making process and mechanisms that are efficient for institutional policies. And here, again, I think we have a lot of insights that we can extract from the social movement literature. For example, the discussions on internal democracy in social movements. Well, again, the work of Donatella, but also of Kathleen Blee, that has looked at how organizational characteristics define social movement organizations' ability to generate consensus, for example. We also know that again, because movement parties come from social movements, they are used to a specific way of organizing, right? And this way of organizing is usually, horizontal and assembly-based, and they have a strong political culture in there, which also might, clash, if you want, with institutional politics and with the rapid decisions that movement parties have to make when they enter the institutional arena, right? So this participatory vision might not always be so easy to adapt. And we have also seen that movement parties, because they've been socialized in recent protest waves in which social media have been such a key element of processes of mobilization. We know that they have this political culture that is very much rooted in online communities and so on, which has an advantage of amplifying, messages and amplifying, the visibility of the work that movement parties are doing, but they also make the relationship with their support base less stable, right? So that also poses an additional challenge. And as Kitchell notes in his text on movement parties face this, inherent dilemma of trying to construct a mechanism of interest aggregation on organizational structures that are apt for the new arena that they're entering. And thirdly, and lastly, there's a third set of challenges that I argue movement parties face, and those have to do with the relationship with the political parties of their sector, right? And this could be applied to movement parties on the left, but also to movement parties on the right. But movement parties emerge because there is an institutional closure, because the existing political parties are not representing their demands, right? And so and so they need to sort of differentiate themselves from the political parties, from their sectors that, that didn't represent their demands. So this sort of, their essence is, in opposition to old politics, right? And there are greater expectations of those political parties on their side of the political spectrum, because they were supposed to support the demands, but maybe they didn't, and that's why they decided to create a movement party. But at the same time, once they enter the institutional arena, they need to build alliances with these political actors. We know, again, from the movement literature that these alliances are key to advance the proposed changes, right? And to advance policy change. So movement parties face this crucial dilemma of differentiate themselves from traditional political parties on the one hand, and in order to consolidate their identity, different from the one of the traditional parties, but at the same time they need to seek alliances with the crucial parties on their side to have the necessary votes to push for reform. So this leads me to the issue of political learning. And as I argue, I think we can understand how movement parties address these three sets of challenges. So challenges related to the social movements that they stem from, the challenges that stem from the internal difficulties of constructing governance and democratic participation, and thirdly, the challenges that stem from the relationship with the political parties of the sector. And I argue that the concept of political learning can help us to understand how they navigate these three sets of challenges. And this is a quote. This is a quote to illustrate how important political learning actually is in political life, and yet we know we have so few systematic efforts to actually try to understand how they work in terms of mechanism, and in terms of understanding who are the carriers of that political learning. So this is a quote that socialist Gaetano Salvemini wrote. It is quoted in Nancy Bermeo's work on the lessons from dictatorship. And he reflects on his behavior as a deputy in the troubled democracy in pre-fascist Italy. And he says, "I must acknowledge that I would have been wiser had I been more moderate in my criticism of the Giolitian system. For while we Italian crusaders attacked him from the left, accusing him of being, as he was, a corrupter of Italian democracy in the making, others assailed him from the right because he was even too democratic for their taste. Our criticism thus did not help to direct the evolution of Italian public life towards less imperfect forms of democracy, but rather toward the victory of reactionary groups. As for the results of the fascist dictatorship, in contrast with those of Italian democracy in the making, they are here before our very eyes. Let us hope that Italians will not be the only ones to learn from that frightful experience." And I have another quote that has to do with the political learning that has shaped the political landscape in the case of Chile. So in Chile, as you all know, we had a 17-year-long dictatorship between 1973 and 1990. And during that dictatorship, political parties and social movements worked hand in hand in order to, overcome the military regime and restore democracy. And during this period, the political parties that on the left that had been very active during the Salvador Allende government in the early 70s did a lot of reflection about their behavior during that period. And there was a lot of criticism towards themselves in the sense of arguing that excessive mobilization and excessive polarization had been a part of the democratic breakdown. And this lesson and this, conclusions of that reflection, that was, as I said, a long reflection that took place during most of the military regime, where, political parties started to reorganize and started to decide on which route to take to restore democracy, had, as I said, long-lasting implications and consequences. That also relate to the current process, because if we think of processes as dialectical, we could actually argue that the rise of the Frente Amplio in Chile is sort of a reaction to this political learning. And so, as Kenneth Roberts argues in his book on this process in Chile and Peru, he says that this learning about the more moderate route that needed to be taken, given that excessive mobilization had been detrimental for democracy in the early 70s. He says, this learning was a product of the traumatic events of the early 70s, when the left gained political power for the first time, lost it in a military coup, and suffered severe repression as a result of its strategic miscalculations. This crushing defeat provoked intense debate within the left-wing political and intellectual elite. Different tendencies maneuvered to interpret the causes and assess responsibilities for the destruction of the Chilean road to socialism. And in the process, they extracted lessons from the experience that would shape patterns of resistance to the military dictatorship that followed. And that lesson was that that Chile needed to take like an institutional route to restore democracy. And so in 1988, we had a plebiscite in which we could vote yes or no to the continuation of the Pinochet regime, because of that political learning, so to say, that the leaders of the political parties on the left in Chile had undertaken during this process. So these two quotes just to illustrate the importance of political learning in political life, and as I will argue, the need to further specify what it means and what the implications are in the specific case now of movement parties. So how can we define political learning? Well, here I provide a preliminary definition as the cognitive change that makes political actors to reevaluate their objective strategies and actions. In the case of movement parties, this political learning involves a reflexive process of learning how to navigate this new arena that they are entering, right? They go from the social movement arena to the institutional arena, in which it must operate and address the challenges that I outlined before. And so underpinning this idea of political learning is an understanding of human agency that highlights how actors' expectations and actions are formed and modified by the use of resources and the changes that occur in them. And here I'm following the work on Mahoney and Schneider and the work of historical institutionalism in general. And so So a second question I would say, after defining political learning, is where is political learning sort of located? So who are the carriers of political learning? And this work, I argue that there are two carriers, at least two carriers of political learning. So one is are the activists with a long history of militancy, right? And again, we know from social movement scholarship that commitment and long trajectories of militancy are really important for the development of social movements. And so I think we can extrapolate those insights to understand also how political learning sort of is transmitted through leaders and through militants with long trajectories, also in movement parties. And also there's a literature here with advanced by Lorenzo, Zamponi, about how activists remember, and that of course is also key in order to evaluate previous protest waves and sort of extract the political lessons from previous protest waves in order to act upon the new protest waves, or in this case within the new institutional form, which is the political party. And we also know from social movement scholarship that leadership is key, right? as McAdam and colleagues argued, it is not enough to have information for someone to adopt a new idea. It will depend on there being a minimum of identification between the person who innovates and the person who adopts the innovation. So, of course, the personal characteristics of the leaders is also key in terms of, I argue, transmitting political learning, right? And so a second carrier, so where this political learning is located, so to say, are organizations, of course, right? Social movement organizations learn and adapt and transform their repertoires of action. And we know, again, from social movement literature that in diffusion processes, there are important processes of social contagion with other groups. Other groups join, imitate the repertoires of action, and so on and so forth, right? So, and so which are the mechanisms through which political learning is transmitted? And so here I argue that there are two, again, at least two, we'll see, maybe there are more, but at least two. One is brokerage, that in principle can be undertaken by both organizations and individuals. And there's a long discussion on brokerage, I won't go too much into that. And the second mechanism is organizational adaptation. So how organizations also decide to rethink and reshape their organizational structures in order to better act on, the political context in which they have to operate. Right, and this is just to illustrate the previous issues of political learning. The carriers and the mechanisms. This picture is of Victor Orellana, who's currently the subsecretary of higher education, but he's well-known student leader. He was present as a high school student as a leader of the 2001 mobilization in Chile. He then participated actively in the 2006 Pingüino movement in Chile. And then also through the organizations in which he participated, he also was, very important in the 2011 mobilizations. So he's been there for ages, so to say. And he has also transitioned through the different organizations. Right, so he was part of the creation of a think tank that is called Nodo 21, and they sort of tried to be some sort of organic intellectuals to the student movement in general. From there stems the Izquierda Autónoma also, or they're like brother organizations, so to say, a political organization that was also very influential in student politics. From the Izquierda Autónoma, they decided to create their own political party, and that's Comunes. And now, currently, actually, in these days, Comunes is converging into one party with all the other organizations of the Frente Amplio. So they're going to become one single party. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But this is just to illustrate the importance of the continuities of certain, historical militants that have been there forever, and that take their, lessons, take their evaluations of the political context and of the response of the, incumbent governments. They take those lessons to the organizations, and those organizations also adapt to those realizations. Right. Okay, so this takes me to the case that I want to illustrate this framework with, which is the Frente Amplio in Chile, which, as I mentioned, was composed initially by 14 organizations. So, as you might know, Chile has had like a wave of protests in. It's almost like every 5 years, but recently we have them a little bit more regularly even. So the Concertación governments that, as the quote by Kenneth Roberts showed, adopted a very moderate route both to policymaking and in the sense of not trying to revert the neoliberal system that had been, introduced by the military regime, but also moderate in the sense of its relationship to social movements. This idea, this conclusion that they sort of made, reflecting on, the causes of the democratic breakdown, that had to do with excessive mobilization, excessive polarization, led many of those leaders that, of course, were really traumatized by the experience of the democratic breakdown, and also by maybe their role in this process, led them to, adopt a very moderate route. And this meant a gradual disconnect with those social movements that had been key in fighting against the military regime during much of the 80s. And so, of course, this disconnection meant that they had increasingly difficulties to, channel social unrest that, as I mentioned, started to emerge throughout different protest waves. And this has been very much documented in the literature. And so we had a first, wave of protests in 2001, as I mentioned before, in relation to the case of our current Subsecretary of Higher Education. We had the protest wave in 2006, and importantly, the one in 2011, which was maybe the first, massive protest wave in which, the education system was paralyzed throughout most of the year. And it also had really important consequences in terms of reshaping the power balance within the Concertación, and as I will mention later, it also motivated the expansion of the Concertación to the left, right? So it had crucial implications. And then in 2016, we also have massive protests against the pension reform, and in 2018, we had also a protest wave led by feminist student leaders, the feminist student movement. And so, especially, I would say the 2011 protest wave, as I mentioned, was key in reshaping the political landscape in Chile, because this was sort of the final event that made student leaders to conclude that the Concertación parties, as they were not gonna, represent their demands. So, as one of the Frente Amplio founders and current Minister of Social Development said, she said the post-2011 reflection was that social mobilization was not enough, and that it was necessary to have our own political instruments. And this also importantly was also a reflection that was made in relation to the 2006 student protest and the way in which those protests had been challenged by the first government of Michelle Bachelet. And so, after that reflection, and after the conclusion that the student movement needed a political instrument of their own, that they needed to create their own, adventure into the electoral arena, the Frente Amplio's development into power was really rapid. And I think there we also find a lot of commonalities with the movement parties in Europe. So, in 2012, 1 year after the student movement, Revolución Democrática was created by student leaders from the Universidad Católica in Chile. They, in the subsequent municipal elections, they elected one mayor, and they became formally a political party in 2016. In the 2013 parliamentary elections, 4 student leaders decided to compete and were successful and entered parliament. Then in 2016, Jorge Charp was elected mayor of Valparaíso, Chile's second city. And in 2017, the Frente Amplio was created, initially composed of 14 organizations. And in 2018, they went from 3 members of parliament to 21. So in 2013, the 3 former student leaders were elected. No, 4 were elected, 2 communists and two other, and then Vladimir Milosevic from the Liberal Party also joined. And then in 2018, they all of a sudden had 21. So that, of course, posed a significant challenge. And then 3 years later, Gabriel Boric won the presidential election. And today, I think, as we speak, I don't know when the election is, maybe Cesar knows, but they're voting for, they've already voted to, all these organizations have voted to construct a single party. And now I think they're electing the directive and the leaders of that new party. So this is sort of an overview of the swift rise to power of the and the explanations for the emergence of new parties that I outlined previously, of course, are complementary to the issue of political learning. I'm not trying to propose like an alternative. It's much more a complement. Of course, the Frente Amplio emerged as a reaction to the void of representation by both the Concertación and the Nueva Mayoría, which was this attempt to expand on the left that Bachelet's second government coalition did in 2016. But as one of the Frente Amplio leaders, Paula Poblete, I think she's currently the Subsecretary of Social Development, she said something that I thought was quite insightful. She said, the Socialist Party is so non-socialist that we had to invent another party. So this sort of reflects this idea of the void of representation that the Frente Amplio reacted against and motivated the creation of the political party. And also, of course, there was a very important electoral change, a change in the electoral system, in 2016, if I remember correctly. And that was also viewed as a critical window of opportunity by many of the former student leaders. So if we go back to the challenges that I outlined before, that I argue are specific to movement parties because they emerge from social movements. In the case of the Frente Amplio, we identify a set of difficulties in their, attempt to create a political party and to be part of the institutional arena. So on the one hand, the relationship with the social movements whose demands they sought to represent. So one question was to whether they needed or should, embrace all of the demands of the specific movements that they tried to represent. So one important case at hand is the No Más AFP movement, which is the movement against the existing pension reform, which is in crisis since a decade or more. And so there have been really important mobilizations, and especially in 2016, against the pension system. But of course, the proposal that the No Más AFP movement is quite complex, and so there are a lot of debates internally in the Frente Amplio whether to embrace the whole proposal or parts of it, etc. So they want to, push for that demand, but it's quite difficult to know whether to embrace all of the demands or parts of it. Another question has to do with, to what extent the Frente Amplio organization should be, led by social movements. I mean, what is the power relation of the Frente Amplio vis-a-vis the social movement? And that also has created a lot of tensions, as many of the interviewees assert. And then, of course, they also have like a criticism to social movement leadership. I mean, they argue that there are different levels of maturity among social movement organizations. Many of them, are not well prepared, don't know exactly, what they don't have much clarity in what they actually want to demand. So it's also difficult, to represent their demands when that's not clear, or the leaderships are rotating and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there is the challenge of, making the hard work in parliament compatible with the developing grassroots relationship with the grassroots, right, and with the social basis. And this was a challenge that was highlighted by all interviewees because, as I mentioned, the Frente Amplio went from 3 deputies to 21. So the amount of issues that they had to vote on the amount of committees they had to be part of, and have a clear position on, required a lot of work and a lot of human capacity, so to say, in the midst of this challenge of at the same time developing internal organizational structures that could take the input from the social basis. And then a last difficulty that many interviewees highlight is the distrust from social movement leaders. And this takes me to one of the contextual factors that I mentioned previously. So movement parties, current movement parties, the recent movement parties, Frente Amplio, but also the ones maybe in Europe, they emerge in a context of deep distrust and decline of trust in political parties and so forth. And not because they have emerged from social movements, they are exempt from that distrust. I mean, many people see them as politicians as anyone else. So they have to deal with that distrust, even if they come from social movements. So we also, identify certain ways in which the Frente Amplio tried to, overcome these difficulties. One was, sharing their experiences, and Giorgio Jackson, who was one of the first 3 deputies, he actually, wrote a manual that he distributed to these other 18 or 20 deputies that were elected in 2018. So they were like clear, his sort of way of doing things in general in parliament, but also within their constituent offices and so on and so forth, were like written down in a manual. They also had a strong, when they met their constituencies in the territories, they encountered a very clientelistic methods of like relationships. So people were used to, politicians coming there and like offering stuff, like offering, a bingo, and they, had to sort of reshape and re-educate, so to say, the social movement basis in the sense that, we're not doing politics in this way. So as the quote says, like, I'm not coming to give you money, resources, or things to raffle, because we do not do that. We're not going to do that. We think we can give you other tools if you want training, dissemination, etc. So that was a key challenge, and that was the way in which they tried to, overcome those practices to sort of root their work in the territories. And they also tried to organize in different fronts. So they had a feminist front, the environmental front, the workers' front, and so on and so forth. Specifically in charge of, trying to address the demands originating in those areas. And also the organization of the constituency offices was designed in a, for instance, Gabriel Boric, in Punta Arenas in southern Chile, he had like his constituency office was sort of a cultural house. So they had a lot of events and, readings of poetry, books, etc. So they sort of thought of the constituency offices in a different way. And of course, the use of social media to amplify their work and to give more visibility to what they were actually doing. In terms of the internal relationships, so the challenges related to the internal construction of governance structures and decision-making processes that were, akin to the ways in which they were used to organize as social movements. There were also a lot of difficulties. And of course, the very issue of being 14 organizations posed a lot of challenges. But they knew they needed to, create parties because they had previous experiences of supporting candidates on the left that were very personalistic. So they wanted their own party, and they wanted to construct organization. There was a clear, mandate of that. But the flexibility and also the number of organizations, of course, complicated decision-making processes. And also we need to remember, all of you know that social movement are always composed of multiple organizations, and there's always a power balance between these organizations within movements, right? These organizations that have been fighting, at the university level, at the trade union level, etc., and now they have to work together, but there still is distrust between organizations. So there was a clear reluctance to delegate decision making because of these, trajectories that they have, and this also posed a challenge. And then also the issue of the time-consuming work in Parliament, making that compatible with, at the same time, as I said, constructing internal governance structures was a challenge. And so I don't want to give you more details about this, but part of this process has meant that we have gone. Some of these organizations have left the Frente Amplio because of political fights and so on and so forth. But those who remained have initiated important convergence processes. So we've gone from 14 organizations in 2017 to one political party in 2024. And finally, the challenges related to the relationship with the political parties of their sector. So when Michelle Bachelet won her second term in office in 2016, she, as I mentioned, broadened the concertación to the left and included the Communist Party. And this new coalition was called the Nueva Mayoría. And from the perspective of the student leaders of the 2011 protest wave, this was a threat in the sense that this was an attempt to sort of, manage the political conflict with the existing political actors. So that was also part of the motivation for why, entering the institutional arena and creating their own political parties. There was a deep mistrust in the concertación parties because of this, trajectory of, responsiveness and incomplete answers and, void of representation in some, that the concertación parties, which was a coalition composed of center-left political parties, had being characterized for. So, of course, this was very difficult because now the Frente Amplio organizations, some of them, not all, but many of them had a parliamentary representation. And so to pursue their political program, they at the same time needed, right, to have to construct strategic alliances with these same political actors. At the municipal level, many of the interviews argue that it was easier to collaborate. But at the parliamentary level, this was difficult in the sense that they needed to differentiate themselves to old politics, to sort of consolidate their the party identity, as different from the other one. This, of course, didn't last for too long, because Boric became president in 2021, and he clearly didn't have, the organizational capacity to, form government only by the organizations that formed the Frente Amplio, and he needed a broader base. So, as this picture shows, when Boric won the presidency, he included in his first cabinet some prominent figures of the concertación, as for instance, Carlos Montes over there, that is the Minister of Infrastructure. And with the subsequent cabinet shuffles, they had more and more members of the concertación parties have been included in government. And so that's the story of the Frente Amplio. And so a few comparative insights to finish the presentation. So as I've been insisting on, and as also Donatella and colleagues insist in their 2017 book, there are contextual factors that make, I argue, that the challenges that the current movement parties face maybe particularly difficult. But in Latin America, as I mentioned earlier, we do have experiences of movement parties. And these experiences have had mixed results, I would argue. And here I draw on the work of other colleagues, Fernando Rosenblatt's brilliant book on party vibrancy and democracy in Latin America, in which he, for example, asks the question, what is it, I mean, in this context of general decline of political parties, what is it that makes a few parties actually maintain their vibrancy? And so and survive throughout time. And he works on the case of Uruguay's Frente Amplio, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a political party that has its roots and has been able to maintain its roots in social movements. And he develops a theory in which he, argues that there are four main variables that define whether movement parties are able to maintain that strong attachment among activists. One is purpose, the ability of a party to unify around a project or ideas. Trauma, and that's interesting because it has to do with this, cognitive dimension of politics that I think is very much understudied. Trauma, which prompts, the retrospective organizational loyalty rooted in earlier shared experiences in a context of dictatorship and authoritarianism. I think this is really important because these are experiences that really bond together people. Channels of ambition and moderate exit barriers had to do with the more institutional factors that also, define the survival of social movement. Channels of ambition has to do with, the parties have to be sufficiently, porous to sort of make people that have an ambition of a political career to want to join the organization. And moderate exit barrier has to do with, the fact that the institutional setting or design is so that it's difficult to actually leave the party. So the Uruguayan case, many have argued, is a case of a movement party that has been able to maintain its roots in social movement, in the terminology of Fernando Rosenblatt, is a movement party that is vibrant in that sense. The other case that has been widely discussed in the literature is, of course, the MAS, the Movimiento al Socialismo. Santiago Anria's excellent book, When Movements Become Parties, looks at the MAS as a deviant case from conventional wisdom on political parties, because he shows that party was not when it professionalized, it didn't lose its roots in the social basis, and he argues that has to do with the way in which the party was constructed, with a wide variation in the manner in which they concentrated power and internal organization. And so that made that social movement still had some strength and still had some ongoing capacity to influence, the party elite. And lastly, I think maybe a case that is not so successful in terms of, maintaining its roots in social movements is the Brazilian Workers' Party. In Ngomes's work on the specific period of the Lula administration from 2003 until 2010, he shows that while the PT, in its initial years, because it was founded in 1980 and it didn't become part of the national government until the 2000s. He shows that in those initial years, the PT had a strong root in social movements, but not only that, it developed participatory mechanisms in order to empower citizens as a way of thinking a governability strategy, as a way of empowering citizens so they could push for reform. So it was a little bit the opposite of what happened in Chile, in which the governability strategy was rather to moderate and sort of decompress social mobilization. That was the governability strategy to sort of consolidate democracy in Chile. In Brazil, it was the opposite. So the PT actively, sought to empower citizens to have more force on the streets to sort of push for their political program. But that was lost, Hernan Gomez argues, during the Lula government. There are all sorts of reasons. There are some institutional ones that had to do with the fragmentation of the electoral system, which of course had to, as we all know, was part of the reason why we had this huge corruption scandal in Brazil, because they were so fragmented, the parliament, that the government had to sort of bribe so many different people in order to pass their reforms. So that, I would argue, and I think many would argue, is a not successful case of maintaining those roots. And so, to conclude, one thing I think is important is to, when we look, as many of us have done, because we have followed the social movements that maybe we initially studied, we have followed them throughout their process of institutionalizing and becoming political parties. And I think in that analysis, I think we can take many of the tools that we have from social movement scholarship to sort of open the black box of how movement parties operate and how they develop. And in doing so, I think we can also shed light on how whether they will survive or not, right? Because Kitchell, in his work in his text on movement parties that has been revisited, he argues, he's of the opinion that movement parties is rather like a temporary form, right? That movement parties are mostly electoral vehicles of a social movement mobilized around a single issue. So he doesn't have much faith on movement parties. But I think there's an open question whether this is true or not. And I think we still need to explain what makes it the case when they don't, and what makes the case when they do. And I think we as social movement scholars have a lot to contribute. And the second thing is that I think the survival of movement parties is important because it has the potential to partially, correct deficits of democratic representation, because they do emerge as a way of covering voids of representation that haven't been covered by existing political parties. The relationship to social movement base is key also in this same context, because democratic participation, because when democratic participation is deficient, those parties become more, elitistic, right? And they might, become dominated by single leaders. And we in Latin America have a lot of experience of, single leaders and populist and personalistic politics. So it's also the issue of whether they connect and they are rooted in social movements. Also important, I think, more general for the regime, or for the electoral system as a whole. Of course, also maintaining those roots is important because it has the potential to empower historically marginalized groups and citizens that have, whose concerns have been excluded from the political discussion. And the internal relationships and the ways in which movement parties construct internal democracy are also central, because if they're not able to construct, participatory but efficient governance structure, there are limited opportunities to exert voice, right? And again, this might, lead to more elitistic, party structures in which we see, the rise of populist and personalistic politics. And finally, the relationship to other political parties from their sector is central too, because the agendas of movement parties are often very ambitious, and so they need to construct alliances with other political forces in order to pursue those ambitious agendas. And so, and just this is the last one, I promise. And yet we know that the challenges faced by recently created movement parties are difficult. The rapid pace with which they came into power, the sharp decline in trust in political parties, as I mentioned before. The context of fake news and disinformation, that also makes it hard to sort of construct their identity and construct new constituencies. We've had a set of crises, a security crisis. It's very present in Latin America, the pandemic, economic crisis, and of course the emergence of counter reactions and counter movements that politicize those issues that movement parties on the left have raised and articulate like a reaction against that. So those factors, I think, makes it difficult to movement parties to address the challenges that and so I think this difficult suggests that movement parties might be a temporary form of political party and only, of course, a partial solution to the crisis of representation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sofia, for this in-depth presentation of an important problem and an important case studies put in a comparative perspective. I'm happy to have also two outstanding discussants from Scuola Normale Superiore, Daniela Chironi and Lorenzo Zamponi, and I give the floor to Daniela.
Thank you, Donatella, and thanks a lot to Sofia for bringing back movement parties in our discussion. We have worked a lot with Donatella and with many colleagues on movement parties in Europe, and we also had the occasion to start this comparison between Europe and Latin America with Kenneth Roberts when he came here. And so it's interesting to continue the discussion, Also, considering the recent developments in Europe, in particular in France, with the role of La France Insoumise in the last elections, in the last parliamentary elections in France. And in fact, the connection between this party and the social movement has been very important to prevent the far-right success. And from this point of view, I want to start in reality from your last slide, because you said there is a strong possibility that movement parties are a temporary form of political party. And this is something that I was thinking about when reading your paper and also during your presentation. You said that there are challenges for movement parties, very important challenges. And I think that there are very important challenges also for us scholars of movement parties. And one of these challenges is, in fact, to understand whether this form of party can or cannot be long-lasting. You know that in party studies, there is this difference between foundation of a party, consolidation of a party, and then change. We, as scholars of movement parties, tend to focus always on foundations. So at the beginning of this process, how movements contribute to establish parties. And then we do not focus so much to what happens later. And this is something that I realized also in your paper. You anticipate that you will not dig into the developments after 2019. And I think that this is something that I did as well, because I was studying Syriza in the moment in which Syriza was rising together with the movements. But then when Syriza went to government, I kind of saw my object of study disappearing in front of me. But wouldn't it be important to study and to focus on these? What are the mechanisms, also in terms of political learning, that is the mechanism that you focus on, that are important in order for this form of parties that, after all, are forms of democratic, internally democratic parties and parties that keep relationships. What will be also in terms of political learning that makes these parties more long-lasting? I was also wondering why or whether you are planning to focus on learning and transnational diffusion. You say that learning can be very much connected to the process of diffusion of knowledge, but then why not looking also in a comparative perspective to processes of learning from other national experiences? This is another limit that we have as movement party scholars. We always focus on similar cases or cases that are developing in the same moment of time. Is there any possibility that movement parties can learn from experiences that that have developed in other contexts and in other moments? In particular, for instance, for the case that you are analyzing, wouldn't it be important to look at whether they are looking at Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, in order also to learn from this experience, not only in their foundation, but also in their development. Yes. Another point that I was considering when I was reading your paper is these two mechanisms that you take into account, brokerage and organizational adaptation. I think that you can make them more clear. Brokerage is okay. Basically, as far as I've understood, is the 5 people, mostly the people who were elected before the actual foundation of the party in 2017. But what is the role of social movements in this brokerage process? This is, again, something that we do very much when we study movement parties. We become very much concerned with the point of view of the party leaders. I did the same, and you also anticipate that you consider party leaders a very important source of information, and I completely agree with you. But then we miss the voice of the movements. And I think that when you say that movement scholars can contribute a lot to the study of movement parties, what we can do is abandon this vision of focusing on the party elite and started instead to focus, first of all, not anymore on the party elite, but on what is happening on the ground, so at the territorial level, and what is happening in the movement, so the perspective of the movements in relation to the party, rather than the always, we tend to always look at the opposite. And I think this is a limitation that we do to ourselves and that we shouldn't be doing it anymore. Yeah, and then just really a minor point on neoliberalism. You focus a lot on contextual factors, but mostly on political factors. What are, also with Mario, we realized that economy matters. And in reality, the studies of movement parties in Latin America have often said that the economy matters. What is the role of the economy, I think, should be taken into account very carefully. What is the role of the economy in both the rise and, as I was saying, the future development, the subsequent development of the movement parties? And either than these reflections on how we can work and study on these movement parties, I really congratulate you for this beautiful contribution that you are working on with your project, and we look forward to see the developments of your work.
Thank you, Daniela. Lorenzo?
Yes, well, thanks a lot. Okay, because I remember in the other day that the first time Sofia and I met, we were both PhD students working on the student movement in different countries. She was working on the Chilean case, I was working on the Italian and Spanish case, and then I'm thinking, where, well, we are here, but the people we interviewed had very different trajectories in the different countries, okay? and comparing what these people have been doing in Chile and in Spain and what they're doing in Italy makes me a little sad. That's it. But huh? Sure, sure. No, all jokes apart, Daniela raised some very interesting points on movement parties. I'm going to focus more on the learning part, okay, of your paper, and then some things which are a bit more case specific. As you know, because we've already discussed it, I'm very interested in this concept of political learning, how we learn within social movement processes and so on. And it's something which is difficult to situate, okay? And in order to build a literature, you've been interpreting and reconstructing different parts of the social movement theory, I think in a very interesting way, because you never know what learning is really about. Are we learning about when we're talking about movement learning, is it about the content? Is it about the procedure? Is it about the strategies of the movement and so on? And in your case, it seems clear to me that you're thinking about ways of doing politics, okay, a certain understanding of how politics is supposed to work and how you can make it work, and in a peculiar context, which is a transition between different types of actors, between movement and parties. And while you were presenting and you started discussing also the long-term heritage of the 1970s and the coup and so on, it made me think, obviously, I told the literature on memory and so on, because this is the conservative side of learning, no? The cautionary tales of how things went bad and all the things we have to avoid in order to make things go in the same direction away. And we know that in many narratives of political transitions to democracy, this kind of conservative political learning can take on a very strong constraining role. Okay, I'm thinking about on the Spanish case. Okay, in which everything which was too contentious or too radical for decades ended up being compared to the civil war, and thus it has to be avoided because. And I think in the Chilean case there is something like that. Okay, within the memory of the 1970s. But coming back to political learning in the short term. I think that what you're pointing at are a series of practices. Okay, so how you have different groups work together, how we've done certain things within the movement, can we replicate certain models of working together and so on, and also within the party system. But also, I think, and I want to push you a bit on this because this doesn't emerge so much from the paper and the presentation. I think there is also a process of political learning on the zeitgeist, I don't know, of what's around there, on how you read a reality, okay, that is very clear in the transition from movement activists into party leaders. And thinking about that because whenever we're talking about movement parties, there is always the expectations that those who build the party are somehow a representative of the movement. That the movement is the party is a representation of the movement. While I think that it is rarely the case, okay. While very often it is the case that it is an adequate interpretation of the movement, okay. And this is what makes it interesting. And I think this is what makes it particularly interesting in the case you're describing, in which you have people who emerge as political figures within a movement, which is Student Protest 2011, but then gain political power within another wave of contention, this is social of 2019. In which the capacity was to produce an interpretation of what that movement was about that was satisfying to a significant amount of the electorate. yeah, I wanted to know what you think about that, and also, well, only one last thing on the relationship between movement and parties. Okay, you saw it, you described it from the point of view of the party people. Okay, obviously it would be interesting also to see it on the other side. Okay, and and this is important for what I was saying before of representation and interpretation, because we often tend to conflate movements with movement activists, but we know that movements tend to engage a wider part of the public opinion. And to me, it was very interesting what happened with Gabriel Boric during the protest of 2019. Within the movement, at a certain point, it was contested for signing the negotiation and so on and so forth. Then actually the significant outcome of that movement was also to make him president. Okay, and I think on this we have to find a way to distinguish the relationship with movement activists and the relationship with a wider part of the public opinion who might share movement goals, but also be more open to political representation. And a final thing I wanted to ask you about is there is also another political outcome of the student process of 2011, which you mentioned in the paper, which is not strictly movement party, but it is other student leaders becoming members of the parliament and now ministers within another party, which is the Communist Party. Okay, and now you have within the same government, you have Gabriel Boric, you have Giorgio Jackson, you have Camila Vallejo, and also you have Cario Cariola as Speaker of the House. It's all a big reunion of 2011. And I wanted to know, is the capacity to build a convergence also outside the movement party, but with other actors, is also this an outcome of the fact that these people shared, although contentiously, of course, a similar background, okay? Or it is like, for them, it is like relating with any other party leader or any other Communist Party official. Thank you.
I would like also to have some time for the floor. Would you prefer to have 5 minutes now or to wait for? Okay, perfect. Floor is open. Yes. Ali, then Hans-Jörg, and then Walter.
I have first, thank you so much for it's very informative, very interesting work. I'm really looking forward to read more of it. I have two questions. First one is about the relation or the role of repression in the relation between the party and the movement and in the learning process. Yes. Because, for example, like we have always been in this dilemma in Egypt, in Tunisia, in other places, that the parties tell us, okay, you have more space to maneuver. Even if repression is very heavy towards you, it's not that concentrated, like how it can dismantle entire parties.
No, go ahead.
But I would like to know more on this. And then I would like also to build a bit on Daniela's point on the economy and the transformation in the system in general. What is the learning process and how can we understand the effects of a certain learning process? And how can we observe and measure a dramatic change in the history? Certain acts be out of a learning process or because simply they didn't have a space or the system is not. Because I was personally very confused with my own field work on a revolt that happened in our village in 1992 and then in 2011. This village didn't revolt in 2011 in the big revolution, while in 1992 they made a magnificent revolt in a very complicated time. Like the historical context was very bad. Still, they made a magnificent battle. Yet in 2011, the conditions were much easier. The political opportunity were there to revolt, they didn't. And when I did the interviews and the field work, they all refer to the work of memory, trauma. Uh, so I went back after 5 months of field work, very happy. And then when I was reflecting again, and I asked myself, okay, there's something missing. It can't be that discursive, and it can't be only about the perception. Something missing in the equation. And then it was the context itself and the level of repressions that they have been exposed to. When I made a follow-up field work again, I discovered something very interesting in this process. Was no real necessity to revolt. Not out of the learning process that was mentioned different times, but it was like the context wasn't there. And then those who wanted to revolt, even the National Democratic Party members, allowed them to go to Alexandria. So if you want to revolt, go to the other city and revolt as much as you want. And then I got very confused about where is the effect of memory, where is the effect of the learning process, and where is the effect of the structural and historical conditions.
Thank you, Hans-Jörg.
And as a general comment to this literature on social movement parties, my impression is that there is not that much emphasis on constituencies or the role of electorates. So usually the explanation goes around this symbiosis between movements and parties, the organizational structure. And nevertheless, I think it is a key element to the understanding of social movement parties to understand also electorates, which are different from constituents of social movements and which might change the whole dynamics of social mobilization, because you need to win elections once you have a party. And this happens under different conditions than simply protest or protest events. So I wonder whether you have some ideas how to bring in the study of electorates here, which might be particularly relevant actually when you wish to understand political learning, because here you have the same bias that political learning is often thematized in terms of professionalization almost, or political socialization of the party leaders. But learning actually implies much more. It is also, there's a cognitive element in the way experiences and knowledge are exchanged, in the way also you might react or anticipate public reactions, or also to respond to public demands or expectations. And all this requires a broader conceptualization of learning that brings in also publics and electorates.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for the very interesting presentation. I have two hopefully brief questions. So the first one builds a bit on what it was already said on the literature on movement parties, which is not mine, but is collateral to what I'm doing. And when reading that literature, I always feel that there is a tension, or if not an ambiguity, but maybe this is not the case, between what is implied by this term. No? As a on the one hand, a framework to study the relationship within parties and movements, and on the other hand, a specific object, so the movement party. And probably this, if this is true, no, this ambiguity or tension is particularly unsolvable if focusing on the genetic moment of parties or on the moment in which social movements go electoral. No? And I wonder whether enlarging the scope could be interesting, focusing on some insights from the party literature, which instead doesn't look at movements at all, and they just know that they are the genetic phase. And these elements are or party organization, because it's not just the fact of whether parties and movement are a relationship, but actually how the party is structured, whether it's rooted, how many members are the leadership, and ideology, in the sense that parties need to have a broader and somewhat more coherent ideology. And I wonder whether mapping how different movement parties are after some point organized and which ideology they have, and if and which kind of ties they have with social movements, which would allow to clarify the movement parties literature, both in terms of framework and also of object. No? Because you may have a party which is mass-rooted and with a coherent logic and strong ties to strong social movements, or maybe these things doesn't exist as after some point because the representational phase is already solved by the party, or you may have a party which is not rooted. Social movements are dead because they go in despair. So things maybe already there. I'm not aware, but yeah. And the second question is more of a question because related to the Chilean case, I think it's super relevant to focus on political learning, and it's something which in some other strands of the literature it just forgotten. No, it seems that parties are out of time organizations. But looking at listening to your presentation, if I got it correctly, in the Chilean case, there is the first learning process as moderation to not being coopted, let's say, by and maintain democracy. And then there is the second learning phase in which you actually have to go more radical to fill a representational void, which is created by moderation itself somehow. No, so I wonder at the end what's the political learning, in the sense that it seems like a circular story. So that I mean, listening from the presentation seems like that the fundamental tension is always the same. So I mean, this is a bit provocative. I wonder what is learned at the end. So there is there a phase for each strategy, or there are just some allowing or constraining conditions for each of them? And yeah, thank you.
I wanted to add a couple of questions because you kindly sent me the paper, which I enjoyed reading. And when I was reading it, I thought to map this process of learning, one could learn from the literature on cross-national diffusion in being explicit about learning what. And I think this is something that Lorenzo addressed, and in the paper, sometimes it's the big strategic lessons, but it's not the same for everyone. So Salvemini took lessons that others did not take, but anyhow, it is a big strategic choice. Another thing is the nitty-gritty adaptation to the parliamentary system. And I think this would require different practices and maybe different focuses in the paper. So learning what, but then learning by whom. And it is something that also Daniela has addressed, but I was thinking about it more explicitly, the international dimensions. They're called Frente Amplio, like Uruguay. And it is a frente, so it is something different from Podemos or Syriza. Syriza maybe in the beginning. But I think these international dimensions would also be relevant because it also goes through the movements themselves. And in learning how, then is also, I think there are the type of mechanisms that you described, but maybe also the two, double militancy, that I think is an important element also in the definitions of a movement parties, until when this double membership exists, and the type of adaptations in the party organizations. Especially Andrea has been one of the few who has addressed the consolidation. So after the genesis, how mass interacted with the different type of social movements in the countryside and in the cities. And he noticed the fact that there were some specific, let's say, structures in the parties, open to the movements, some role that was given also to the Cocaleros movements. And I think this would be also interesting to trace when you look at the specific dimensions of the political learning, which is what you point at, but maybe should be carved out more in the final versions of the paper. And this, I think, also helps addressing the questions that also trouble us studying social movements, which is, Kitchell said, is a temporary thing. But there are two elements to address it. One, Walter cited the genetic approach to the movement, to the parties, which says the origins count also in terms of parliamentarian origins. Duverger, I'm thinking about this classical approach, also Weber and so on. So do we want to state that those origins are still relevant? Maybe we should say also when and how. And what seems to emerge in many cases is that these origins are important in times of crisis. So Pétain, that you mentioned as an example, is in fact an example of a party that has tended to co-opt movements. And when I went to Brazil the first times, I said that there was very few scholarship on social movements because the party had substituted it. But then when there was the big challenge with Bolsonaro, some elements of the movement parties, the labor protest and so on, re-emerged. And the same is true with mass, that there was a transformations. Maybe the constitutional process was one such, and thinking about the French examples now, the success of the new Popular Front was due to the mobilizations of movements. And it is to be seen what will remain there. So maybe also this type of implications. I don't believe in Kitchell saying it is just a phase, but I think more explicitly saying when does this genetic type of imprinting comes back into the type of processes in the movement. So very interesting work, I think. I think there is another question. Giuseppe, are you there? Giuseppe, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the brilliant presentation, comments, and the possibility of participating online. It is never to be given for granted. My question is related to the vibrancy of Rosenblatt, was mentioned in the presentation, changing a bit, let's say, this framework, because the first thing I wanted to ask is whether you feel that there is a reinforcement of these elements in the case you have studied and in new progressive movement parties that emerged in the Latin American context, and then in particular with an idea, of course, of changing purpose, bringing back or renovating ideological elements, maybe more following what has been as well developed by movements in the previous years or decades, like in this case of Chile. Whether the channels of ambition could have been, I would say, something quite normative, more ethically achieved than from coming from other movements in another kind of country, usually exactly the way in which ambitions are fulfilled by individuals with individualistic patterns is something criticized in movements and within movements. If this also has brought to a new elaboration of what Rosenblatt calls trauma of this past, shaping so strongly the ideas of people in politics. And at the end, a point that I would like to change a bit, because of course there is the point of moderate exit barriers, but something that I would like to ask you is more about the entrance barriers. Like, since these organizations come from a quite specific, these parties as organizations come from quite specific moments of movement history, in which, of course, some individuals or groups of people were involved. How do they manage to switch to political parties or to movement parties without keeping just the same people in? Like, there is something that has been done to make possible that maybe people with the same ideas or the same principles or the same other elements we have mentioned before, but not coming from that exact personal or collective political history, could manage to enter the party and to then become active in the mobilization of the phases of party action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giuseppe. I give the floor back.
I
to
think I need to
Sofia.
start answering because I have 4 pages of questions. Thank you so
And
much.
10 minutes to
Yes. Thank you so much for all of your questions. This project is actually 2 projects. The project on the Frente Amplio is actually my previous project, but in between there was 2 kids, 1 pandemic, 1 cancer. So it's been a difficult time for me. And now I have a new project which is on political learning in social movements. But so all of these questions sort of helped me to think about how I go about, combining the projects or separating them or not. So thank you so much for all of your questions. I'm gonna start with Daniela and related to what I was just saying. Yes, this paper focuses really on the first period of the Frente Amplio creation, and what I'm thinking is that I would like to. I have the same problem that you've had, that my object of study sort of moves away from me and changes so much. But what I've been thinking lately is that I would like to write this in a book format, and have one part that is, movement parties, with the case of the Frente Amplio as a case, in opposition, and one in power. And I think that makes sense because the challenges are different. Of course, the process of learning is different. So I think that might, and also because I have so much material that I need like the paper format. I think it's just not enough for everything that I would like to write about. So that maybe explains a little bit the confusion and the sort of the narrow period of time that I cover in the paper. And I think that also would help me to address some of the other questions that have come up. For example, whether this is a temporary form, or if it can be long lasting, and if it can be long lasting, how which are the organizational forms that it sort of adapts in the longer term, and so on and so forth. I think the story of the development, I think, is central, not only for like empirically, have a clearer picture of the Frente Amplio, but I think also for all of us more theoretically, just to kind of think of how these processes evolve. I'm definitely gonna have a deeper look at the literature on diffusion processes. As Lorenzo was saying, I'm sort of taking bits and pieces from different, emphasis within the scholar movement, social movement scholarship, to sort of construct this framework. And I think the issue of the diffusion, of course, I've realized is really important, but I think I need to look more at the transnational, and it is very important. I think there are very concrete examples of, all the Podemos leaders have been in Chile, many times, and also the Frente Amplio leaders have been in Spain. I think there are also connections. I remember, when was it? I think pre-pandemic, there was this congressional, like ideological congress, sort of, I think they called it, of the Revolución Democrática, and then they invited a lot of Podemos leaders. So I mean, also I remember Samuel Maceloni, what's his name? Macelini. He was also there. So there are all these transnational dimensions to it that I think are really important to look at. Also, I mean, not only in terms of diffusion of ideological issues, but also I think in terms of how they read the experiences of these movement parties and what has happened to them. I think that's also really important to bring into their story. Yes, your comment about the the need of incorporating the view of the leaders of the movements and the activists of the movements, and I think that relates also to the question of to what extent movement parties actually represent social movements. Like I think that vision and a round of interviews with movement leaders I think is key to sort of cover that part. I've done a lot of work with the feminist movement. And I'm starting now with the environmental movement, but I definitely need to look more into that, because I think the question of to what extent the Frente Amplio actually represents, if at all, the demands and the views of these people is key. And I think this has, and that's part of the reason why I finished, the period that I covered in the papers until 2019, because the social outburst in Chile just sort of reshuffle everything again, like in the sense that it acted as a mechanism of cleavage formation, and so it was so radical, and the need of taking a stance to what was happening was so strong that all of these fights and separations, and so it's a very complicated story. But so I think the view of activists and social movement leaders pre-2019 and post-2019, I think is also really, really important. So that also has to become part of the story. And I think that's why we need like a lot longer, to cover like the Frente Amplio in opposition, the Frente Amplio in power. The issue of neoliberalism is also key, and it's. I didn't give too much details here, but both the student movement is a movement that is against an educational system that is deeply rooted in neoliberalism, and also the No Más AFP movement, the movement against the pension system, is also the issue of neoliberalism and the presence of that criticism in the collective action frame of the different movements have been central, and also within the Frente Amplio. They, at least initially, explicitly say that they were constructing a project to sort of superar, so overcome neoliberalism. That has sort of been watered down a little bit, but that was the initial impulse, and I think that's also an issue that has made many people leave the Frente Amplio, because it has been watered down, because it has had to be more moderate now that the Frente Amplio is in government. Lorenzo, what is the learning about? That's a key central question that needs to, of course, become really clear, and it is about the actions and the strategies and the way navigating politics. That may be a little bit like a fluffy term, and maybe I need to specify it a little bit more. And yes, of course, learning can constrain, and I think that's a really important point. I think if we think of Germany today and all the issues that are taboo to mobilize around, and claim making that are really, you cannot say stuff about Palestine because of the past. So I think that's a key point. So I think the way in which political actors learn can both be, incentivize mobilization, but it can also, of course, constrain. And that was the case of the Concertación. And your name was Walter. You talked about, whether this is a circular process, and I would say it's a dialectical process. It's not. We don't go around in circle, of course, because political actors do, interpret the political context and act upon the political context. And so the Concertación, their learning of the democratic breakdown was one. And of course, and that had the consequences that I tried to depict in the presentation. And the Frente Amplio and the political organizations that compose the Frente Amplio are a reaction towards that. And now, of course, they're moderating their stances a little bit. But I wouldn't say it's circular. I think we still, make some advance, and there are some sort of synthesis of the, lessons that that become part of this process. Yeah. So Lorenzo also raised the issue of if women parties are really representative of the movement, and I think going again back to Daniela's comment, I think definitely around with of interviews with movement leaders, I think is key to complement the analysis. You asked something about the Communist Party, if there's convergence also with them. Yes. I mean, they're extremely close. I think that 2011 mobilization and also the experience in Parliament by the first members of Parliament and the two communist student leaders that also became part of Parliament in 2013. I think all of those years, I mean, they basically have grown up together, so to say. I think they're extremely close. The Communist Party has its own characteristic, it's very, strict and so on. I mean, I always think that Camila Vallejo, if she wasn't a member of Communist Party, she could be a presidential candidate. But because we have such a strong, anti-communist sentiment in Chile, I think she's been there since the very beginning, and I think she's very loyal to the president, to Boric, at the moment, even if she, has her party membership in the Communist Party. But I think they're really close. But I think because the Communist Party is so, have a tight hold of them, I think neither Carol Cariola nor Camila Vallejo will leave the Communist Party. So in that sense, and the Frente Amplio also, I mean, I didn't give too many details about that, but the Frente Amplio is also a reaction against the Communist Party, because the way in which the Communist Party traditionally has organized is very hierarchical, is very, and the Frente Amplio is composed of people that have been politically socialized in a very different political culture. So they're quite important differences there that I think would not, and I don't see like a convergence process between the Frente Amplio and the Communist Party, for sure. But I might be wrong, but I really don't see it. Ali asked me about the role of repression in the relationship, and that's very interesting now that the Frente Amplio is actually in government, because of course we've had processes of mobilization, and the government is now, I mean, Gabriel Boric, a former student leader who, as recent as in 2019, was part of the protests on the streets when we had the social outburst. Now he's in government and he's in charge of the, state apparatus of repression. And there have been a lot of incidents in which, the police, and we do have a police force that is a little bit brutal, I would say. I mean, the police force that is just not used to dealing with the demonstrations. And so we have incidents, and we still are having incidents. We had many incidents in 2019, and we still have. And every time that happens, of course, I mean, I think the Frente Amplio loses another organization, so to say, because it's, yeah. So that's a complicated, it's a really complicated relationship, because at the same time we've had a security crisis in Chile. Violent crimes have gone up so much, so there's a lot of focus in public discussion about security. So at the same time, Boric and the Boric government need to sort of show authority. So it's a very complex relationship, and I think they've struggled a lot to sort of maintain their identity at the same time as, being the serious, guy in town and being in charge of the police force and so on and so forth. The question about the constituency is really interesting, and I go back to my first comment that, when I was trying to contextualize this project within like two large projects, actually. And in the project on political learning in social movements, I actually have an additional carrier, which is a generational carrier, which I think is really important to understand how political learning is transmitted in social movements specifically. Because of course, there is a generation that has been political socialized with certain repertoires of action, with certain policy preferences, and there I think the issue that Daniela was saying about neoliberalism and the conceptions about how public policies should be constructed and so on and so forth, the issue of universalism and so on and so forth, and also specific issues, the whole feminist agenda. So in that project, I'm thinking about having this generational carrier that sort of brings in the understanding of the electorate, as a colleague was saying, but also the understanding of what Lorenzo was saying about the zeitgeist. Because I do think that there is, that social movements are also anchored in of course, in generations and dominant ways in which certain generations are prefer to act politically and to, in the agendas that they sort of prefer. I don't talk about the generational carrier in the project of the movement party, on political learning movement parties, because I think there it sort of overlaps with the issue of the electorate. But I need to think further about this. But thank you for the comment about the constituencies. I think it's really important. How am I in time? Walter had Walter's. I mean, I don't know if I have a specific question, but I think what you were saying, what Donatella was saying about the genesis of movement parties and to what extent that endures, I think is really important. And as I mentioned previously, I think telling the whole story of the Frente Amplio might help to address that question. In Donatella, you also referred to the issue of cross-national diffusion, and you raised an important point because you said something about learning what and by whom. So I think this is a key issue in the sense that we need to sort of, this requires identifying the actors. And that's why the solution that I've come up to, until now, is that to have militants with long trajectories. So, of course, on the one hand, we need to understand, movement bases and talk to activists. But also, I think when we talk about the learning process and how that is transmitted, we need to talk with the long term activists. And there I'm planning to do live stories, actually, with those activists. So it's the learning by them, so to say. And the issue of double militancy, I think that would come up also in the live stories, and to what extent they've been able to combine, their and I already have a few people. That immediately come up to my head, people that have this double militancy, and I know they've struggled, and I know that and they struggle a lot during the constitutional process also because they were there as a representative of a party. But they also have a really strong militancy. I'm thinking about one leader specifically in the feminist movement. So I know that they really struggle with that. And Giuseppe, finally, I don't remember the exact questions, but you talked a little bit about the entrance barriers, and I think that has been an important point because the Frente Amplio, and I think that's the case in other movement parties too, has made such a rapid, career and coming into power so quickly. I think that's been a key factor for attracting new people because it has. Some interviews tell me something like in the lines of, if you are a president of a student federation for one of the political organizations of the Frente Amplio, it's very easy that from there you then become an advisor of a member of parliament, and then you become a candidate for a certain political. So it's been like a trampoline of political careers. And I think that has been very attractive for people to engage and become part of the Frente Amplio, at least until now, I would say. I think that's kind of it, but I think, we don't have much more time. Thank you so much for all the questions and comments, and especially to Lorenzo, Daniela, and Donatella for your comments.
Thank you, Sofia, and it has been a pleasure to have you here, also to have you for a few days more, and we will invite you when the next book is ready. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniela and Lorenzo.
Thank you.